I'm going to introduce you to some of the broader concepts of ecological restoration as they apply particularly to restoration of plant communities. That's our focus today, although our program covers a lot of stuff including lizards and birds and all of those components of the ecosystem. The focus today really is on plants. So first of all, to introduce you to our program, People, Cities and Nature. We've been going now for nearly 3 years, coming up to 3 years. But before that, we did have previous research funding in urban ecology, and so this is sort of a bit of a continuation of our work. I also wanted to point out that although we're from the University of Waikato, the research program is actually a major partnership for groups around the country. And you'll see on the diagram there's the major partners: University of Waikato, Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research, Victoria University, University of Otago, and strangely you might think University of Wyoming. That's what happens when somebody in your team leaves and goes to the United States. And the funder there, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Now the diagram here looks a bit complex, but we'll see if we can work our way through it. So the top circle there is our plantings team, and today that's the focus of our talks today. We have a group of people focusing on lizards. We have others working on predators. John Innes from Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research is the leader of that group. Green space benefits is largely run out of the University of Otago. Claire Freeman, Yolanda Van Heesek, and cross-sectoral alliances is how do we work with business to get better biodiversity outcomes. So we're not just sort of coming at it from the point of view of the environmental end, we're interested in how you link this work in with business opportunities and sustainability opportunities. Maori Values is led by a researcher by the name of Hemi Whanga, based at Waikato University. And so we're working across the country and in many cities around the country and trying to, I guess, take a more of a coordinated and comprehensive approach to how we might restore Indigenous nature in cities, or more commonly, we would say bring nature back into city environments. So I just wanted to give you some background. I know many of you will have expertise in this area, but I know that some people here today may be here for the sort of the first time, their first exposure to some of these issues. Just to remind us of how significant and important our biodiversity is, and when I say our, I mean the New Zealand biodiversity, and the fact that it's highly endemic. More than 80% of our plants and birds and other groups are found only in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as well, of course, because of rapid change in our environment, particularly in recent times, many of those plants and animals are highly threatened with extinction, and the figures looking pretty grim at the moment for some of our organism groups. 41% of plants are classified as threatened, 80% of birds, 88% of lizards, and 100% of our frogs are under threat for all sorts of reasons. And just to reflect a little bit going backwards about where we've come from, the last major landmass in the world that was settled by human beings about 800 years ago, and at that time it was an ecosystem really, and when I say ecosystem I mean the full ecosystem, the land, the water and the oceans. One big ecosystem, and on land dominated mainly by birds and bugs. Rather unusual in the world scene in having the only mammals being the native bats. And in a very short space of time we have made massive transformation to our landscape. So the Canterbury Plains would be one of the examples of where the transformation has been the fastest and the greatest in the world. Essentially in a 200-year period, to largely remove all trace of the New Zealand ecosystem and turn it into a farming ecosystem, an aggregate ecosystem. And of course we've had to do a lot of this because that's our economy, that's how we make a living. But at the same time, the main message for today is how can we make sure that we protect the last good examples of what we've got, and how could we possibly reverse the balance somewhat and make our approach more sustainable than it currently is. So with humans, of course, came many pests. You'll all be familiar with them. We have groups up in our part of the country trying to wipe these out in Hamilton City. You know, stoats and rats and possums, and of course feral cats in particular, are all of the major factors that have led to the decline and extinction of many of our native bird species. And we, of course, on a daily basis, work with trying to manage our weeds. Up our way, Japanese honeysuckle is our big problem, invading into our restoration plantings and smothering them. Woolly nightshade too is difficult. Up our way, gorse can be used very effectively as a nurse crop to bring back native forests, but in some environments, particularly in the coastal environment where it's persistent, we have to deal to it in order to maintain a good plant community on site. Extinction has been a feature of New Zealand's biodiversity, unfortunately. 45 species of birds, depending on how you do the calculation, some people think up to 57 species. I regularly drive through the small town of Puopio and get reminded of the loss of the North Island thrush, was the European name for the Puopio, long extinct now. We really don't know how many invertebrates we've lost from our system. We do know that weevils, large weevils like the one illustrated in the picture there, have been lost across the whole of mainland New Zealand and are now confined to offshore islands. The one in the picture there is one that has been reassembled from body parts found in a buried forest, a forest buried by the Taupo eruption 1800 years ago, to give us an idea of what the giant weevil used to look like. We got all the body parts and stuck them back together and then got an artist to do the illustration. With plants, we've been quite lucky, but the problem is yet fully developed in this country. We've only lost something of the order of 5 or 6 species of vascular plants in the country, and this is one from up where we come from, Hamilton, that has been lost, is fully extinct. Adam's mistletoe, which was found up through the Coromandel and parts of the Waikato, and was last seen in 1958, just out of Hamilton City. So extinction has been a factor, and the history of our ecology and biodiversity has been really one of people getting to grips and understanding what the significance of these impacts have been, of weeds and pests and predation, and then starting to make the early moves of trying to fix the situation. What is the solution to the problem? We can always talk about how bad things are, but our message today really is actually there are things that we can do to make a difference. And reflecting back on the work of Richard Henry in 1894, who was the first European to start moving birds onto offshore islands to protect them from the predators. Unfortunately, the islands that he chose weren't completely protected from the ability of the swimming predators to get back onto the islands, and so some of his experiments weren't that successful. But the thing is, he was the guy who had that idea of actually one way of saving things might be to move them first to a safe environment and rebuild their populations before then controlling the pests and bringing them back in a translocation. And of course the New Zealand Forest Service were experts at this in the mid-70s, and you will all know probably of the story of the black robin and the amazing story of cross-fostering by a bird in order to rebuild that population, remove pests from smaller offshore islands, and essentially bring the black robin back from the brink of extinction. And then more recently, with the Department of Conservation, taking an approach where we've decided that protecting things on offshore islands is one thing, but we really do need to do something about protecting things on mainland New Zealand. Actually, using the word mainland down here probably sounds dead right too. I don't quite mean it in the way that you mean it. So And knowing now that, you know, the current sanctuary movement, which has taken off in New Zealand, where, you know, as of 2019 we have 83 sanctuaries in New Zealand. Those are places where intensive pest control, either through a fence or for some other method of pest control, has got us into a situation where the rarest of our native birds can survive and thrive. Birds like the tiaki and the hihi and all of the others. 83 of those are across the country, and 50% of them now led by the community, not by the government agency. This is another major trend in New Zealand, the transfer of the responsibility back to the people of New Zealand as the stewards or the kaitiaki of our environment. So I wanted now to move into the topic for today and give some thoughts on where we are today. I don't claim to be an expert at all on Invercargill or Southland or large parts of the South Island, but I do know something about the principles of ecology and how they can be applied to restore ecosystems. I guess the big issue for all of us in places where agriculture is important is that what we've got left is not representative of what used to be here. And so we have to constantly have this in the back of our mind about what are we doing about looking after the parts of the landscape where the loss has been the greatest and where in fact the biodiversity was the richest and most diverse. Because holding on to the highlands, the uplands, and all of those systems is great. But in most of lowland and coastal New Zealand, we've lost enormous amounts of biodiversity. And those were the most productive, the richest and most diverse assemblages of biodiversity in New Zealand. So what are we doing about that? And that, you can see that eventually I'm going to get to the topic of urban ecology, because I have a belief that unless we engage New Zealanders, urban dwellers, 87% of us who are urban dwellers, with this issue, then we are in danger of losing the battle across the country. So where is the greatest level of threat? Of course, it's in those zones that were preferred and were developed for agriculture. And you can see, this is a map of what's known as the Threatened Environments Classification of New Zealand, which came out of the work of people like Susan Walker at Manaki Whenua Landcare Research. And you can see the red zone there. And in my lifetime, my focus in my life has been actually trying to turn the red zone back to the green zone. So you can see what has been motivating me is, what are we doing about trying to look after, protect and restore biodiversity in the red zone? And of course here in Invercargill City, the same map applied there. You know, you have reasonably good representation of coastal fringe, estuarine sorts of systems, but the more terrestrial dryland stuff and some of the former swamp forests type habitat is shown there in that red. So you have large chunks of Invercargill City where you are below the 10, what we call the 10% threshold for biodiversity. And you'll hear me focus a bit on the 10% threshold, because once habitat and Indigenous cover gets reduced below a threshold of 10%, there are enormous consequences for the survival of plants and animals on a landscape. I'll show you this shortly graphically. But there's been a lot of work done by ecologists around the world that show that if you do not maintain a minimum of 10% representation of Indigenous habitat on your landscape, you are in danger of being on the slippery slope that leads you to comprehensive local extinction of the whole of the assemblage, plants and animals, because you simply don't have enough of a habitat there to maintain in the long term, particularly in face of continuous change, climate change, whatever the disturbance event might be. So you will hear us talking quite a lot about the 10% minimum, and this is the sort of work that it's based on. The graphs that show along the bottom axis the consequences of when the area of habitat is reduced to less than 10%. There is an out of proportion and exponential decline in representation of the species in the system. And so that's why we're focused on trying to, in urban systems, build habitat levels up to at least 10% and preferably more than 10%, even in city environments. And of course, we're currently in New Zealand in the process of putting together a national policy statement on biodiversity. This is active work right now. At the same time in New Zealand, we are in the business of revising our biodiversity strategy that was produced in the year 2000. It's just about due for its full revision, and work is currently going on both a national policy statement for Indigenous biodiversity. We've been waiting nearly 18 years for this in New Zealand, and a revised biodiversity strategy. And already in the draft, you will see this figure of 10% represented in Policy 19, restoring Indigenous biodiversity in depleted environments. That is essentially in the urban and the peri-urban and some parts of the rural zone where we've dropped below the 10% cover. So it's in there in the draft now, and submissions are being called towards the end of the year on this national policy statement, but there is every likelihood that this policy will be adopted by government of measuring and monitoring whether cities, towns and peri-urban zones are maintaining at least 10% habitat dominated by Indigenous species. So moving on to ecological restoration. Well, what is it? It has been defined internationally. The Society for Ecological Restoration talks about it as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been damaged, degraded or destroyed. And also in that same publication, in a more recent revision published in 2016, the term ecological reconstruction is introduced for situations where you are working with a landscape where there is next to nothing left. And the term ecological reconstruction is used. And that's what we've been doing in many cities in the North Island, in New Plymouth, in Hamilton, in Tauranga, trying to help the city councils there reconstruct new habitat. That's the case where the appropriate biota is almost entirely needs to be reintroduced because it cannot regenerate or recolonize on the site within feasible timeframes, even after assisted regeneration. You need to actually help bring things back. So as I said, the cities that we've been focusing on in the North Island, mainly Hamilton, Napier, Hastings, we've been doing some stuff in Tauranga as well. But the point that I wanted to make today, the key point that I want to make, is restoring existing patches in places that are below the 10% minimum is not enough. If you are serious about preventing extinction in the longer term, you need at least 10% Indigenous cover on the landscape. And so in places like Hamilton, Napier and Hastings, we've been helping those city councils rebuild their habitat back up to the 10% threshold. There is only one city in New Zealand that is anywhere near close to having a 10% minimum cover of Indigenous habitat. Does anybody in the audience like to make a guess about what city that is?
Auckland.
No.
Dunedin or Wellington?
No. Keep going.
Nelson?
Not Nelson.
Wanaka?
No. The city in the region that I was born, New Plymouth. New Plymouth has 8.9% Indigenous cover in the built-up matrix of the city. It is the only city that is close to the 10% figure, the only one. All others do have often resource in the peri-urban zone, but I'm talking in the city, nature in the city. Historical accident? No, not really. It was a design. The early European settlers put in place bush reserves in what was then the peri-urban zone of the city, and the city continued to grow and progressively surrounded patches like Ratapihi bush, Bola Brooklands, been to Bola Brooklands, Pukekura Park, all of those beautiful bits of native bush. So New Plymouth is the only place that's close. And it would only need to reconstruct 35 hectares of Indigenous habitat, and it will be at the 10% figure. Christchurch needs to construct something of the order of 1,300 hectares to get itself to where it needs to be. And in Hamilton, we've got about another 700 hectares to go. So reconstruction then is moving beyond revegetation. Lots of us over the years have been involved in revegetation programs. Essentially, and not being too cruel, that's when you just go around the place and pop some trees in the ground. We're not just talking about planting trees, we're talking about reconstructing assemblages of species that will be self-perpetuating on the landscape, able to regenerate themselves. And we're also talking about not just focusing on the birds, but focusing on the plant community. Because actually, if we're going to really look after our native fauna in New Zealand, we need to have ensured that we brought back the species that they co-evolved with, the ones that provide the services that they need to successfully survive and thrive. Here's the sort of reconstruction we've been involved in Hamilton City. So this is in the northwestern corner of Hamilton City, what was until quite recently near the periphery of the edge of the city, but like many other cities in the North Island at the moment, there is massive subdivision and expansion going on, and the city is extending its footprint. This was a piece of land that was land banked by a former mayor, a politician by the name of Michael Minogue. Some of you may remember that name. He was one of those troublesome politicians that caused the Prime Minister of the time a lot of trouble. Anybody know who the Prime Minister was at that time? Robert Muldoon. So anyway, he helped land bank some land in Hamilton City, and he land banked it on the notion that the city would grow and that it would need more green space and more open space. So it was set aside for green space, but not of the style that we eventually redirected the action in. So it's an area of 65 hectares, and in 2004, at the top image there, you can see what it looks like. Grazing land with a small peat lake and hardly any evidence of what the Indigenous habitat was. Here it is in 2018, and hopefully you can see there the extent of planting that's been going on there, the recreation, the reconstruction of Indigenous habitat. We're up to 32 hectares. We're well on track within another 10 years to have the whole area fully reconstructed, if you like. And within the next 4 or 5 years, we're hoping to raise the funding to put the predator-proof fence around it. It's right next to Hamilton Zoo. People across the road who have expertise in growing on the birds, people in Waiwhakariki who are growing on the plants, and eventually we're going to put the whole thing back together. And that will be the largest patch of Indigenous vegetation in Hamilton City. Currently the largest one is 5.2 hectares. The largest one that was there before this project started. So this has all been done by partnerships with the City Council and community groups, environmental groups of the sort that I know are here in the audience today, all working together. And that photograph, I believe, is a time series. So the picture at the top shows the 2004 September planting that occurred, and the picture at the bottom shows the extent of how well developed the reconstruction is now. So we now have parts of our reconstruction where even after 7 to 11 years, you can walk underneath a low canopy. It does work quite quickly in Hamilton, and I'm not saying it's going to work that quickly around the rest of the country, but because of our mild, warmish, generally reliable rainfall climate, we can grow bush really quickly. And of course, we're building that habitat not just for those plants, but for all the other things that will eventually be able to occupy it. How have we done this? And this is also not just confined to Hamilton. What are the principles that we've used to reconstruct the habitat? Successional framework. We mimic nature. We know the sequencing and the timetabling of how to put our plants in, from the pioneers to the mid-successional to the late successional species. And we have taken up the challenge that the British ecologist Tony Bradshaw gave us in 1983, where he said the ultimate challenge for ecologists is to reconstruct ecosystems. If you can't reconstruct one, you actually don't know how it works. So we've taken up that challenge. We use a successional framework. We start with the pioneers, and then we do enhancement and enrichment planting, and progressively introduce the more sensitive late successional, often shade-tolerant species into the system. And we do this by looking at nature and mimicking nature. So the principle 2, what's your reference ecosystem? And the diagram here just basically shows that as you go through a process of restoration and reconstructing, what you're doing is increasing the similarity of your piece of work to a reference ecosystem. Here would be a potential reference ecosystem in Southland. You know, what if you were recreating a forest? You would go and look at an old growth forest somewhere and use that as your reference ecosystem. Principle 3, right plant in the right place. Every plant has its own tolerances, environmental tolerances, every species, and the best place for it to grow. And you can waste a lot of money in restoration planting by putting plants in the wrong place. We've all done it. We learn by our mistakes, but it's important to try and learn as we go, as early as possible, where would be the best place to put them. And of course, it's often about understanding the microtopography and soil type of a landscape. We do a lot of planting in valley bottoms and gullies in Hamilton, and we've learnt very quickly about the relative inundation that different species can tolerate and the different soil drainage that is required for them to maintain themselves on the site. And so we always look at the topography and the water table and the soil type and try and get the right plant in the right place. You all know the principle here just from the image. The levee beside the stream is well drained, but the back swamp isn't. And if you don't get that right and put the plant in the wrong place, you will lose them. These handouts were produced actually by Auckland Council, again for their big project up there called Twin Streams, where they've really focused on getting the right plant in the right place. In Hamilton, we've used a target or reference ecosystem based on our knowledge of pollen analyses, remnant compositions, and macrofossils to build an understanding of how the native plants were distributed on the topography of gullies. And we use this in a gully guide that goes to all landowners who back onto a gully, the Gully Restoration Guide, as the target or reference ecosystem for the restoration planting we're doing there. So again, you can see the profile of the gully. The things that grow on the ridge top or on the slope must be different to the ones that are growing in the back swamp or on the levee beside the stream. Principle 4, thinking about the whole process more broadly than just the little tiny place you're currently focused on in doing your planting. In other words, taking a catchment functional approach, thinking about the whole of the catchment, because what happens upstream of you will impact on what you're trying to achieve, and what you're doing will impact on somebody further down the catchment. And so catchment function is the other major principle that should always be considered when doing restoration planting. Wetlands, particularly susceptible. You can be doing lots of restoration work on a wetland somewhere and then find that somebody upstream or somebody nearby has done something to compromise your water table or change your water flow, and all of the work that you've done is essentially of no use. So the map there just showing the major catchments of your area, and the point is that restoring function in the catchment, lifting our sites to above the particular site that we're working on, is important if we're really going to make a difference at a broader scale. Urban catchments are the biggest issue of all. You know, we're focused on trying to restore urban centres, and of course urban catchments are the most highly modified of all, and they present us with many challenges. So here's a few examples of what the challenge is. The major challenge, of course, in urban systems is large amounts of impervious surface and flows of water and changes in the hydrological cycle. You know, impacts where most of that water is actually being intercepted by structures or impervious surface, and then very rapidly races towards the water channel, and all sorts of consequences of that, particularly for people doing restoration planting. This graph here is the one that I live with on a daily basis in a Hamilton gully. So because of all the impervious surface in the city, and because after an intensive rainstorm all of that water very quickly migrates towards the waterway, you have what is called stream flashiness, and that's the big, the red line there is the runoff peaking very rapidly after a rainstorm. So I can be in my gully bottom and plant out my nice native plants ready to go, and then all of a sudden there's a major storm up catchment, and because of the flashiness of the system, within 15 minutes the water will rise, completely fill the water channel, start a small flood, and all of the plants that I put in will be washed away. So urban systems are particularly problematic in terms of how we manage the catchment. And increasingly around cities in both New Zealand and the wider world, people are taking what's called a low impact urban design approach, where they're trying to work with nature to make sure that we don't create artificial conditions like the flashiness of the stream, which then prevent us from maintaining and in the longer term and looking after our nature. So what we do is, you know, we focus on the stream. We try to build the sides of the stream up to provide shade for the stream and improve the habitat for the fish that live in the stream as well, the native fish, the cockapoo and others. And in some parts of Hamilton City, we're doing what is called daylighting, where we're actually removing culverts, reopening the stream up to sunlight, and removing barriers that prevent migration of the native fish, for example. Again, it's about taking that whole system approach to try and bring those ingredients back into the urban setting. And of course riparian planting, which is a major feature of many areas of the country now. And knowing that the width of the riparian zone is critical in terms of what service it can provide. if the goal is to protect water quality, the width of the buffer will be different to if the goal is to reinstate biodiversity. So the difference between slim riparian strips, which are there just to prevent some water quality damage, compared to a corridor for reinstating ecological function in a catchment is completely different. The ecological corridor will need to be way broader than the one where people are just focused on water quality. These principles are now being applied in parts of the North Island, for example, up in the Taranaki region, where the Taranaki Regional Council started with this amazing riparian planting scheme, in which now 95% of streams and rivers in the whole of the Taranaki ring plain now have riparian planting, and are now starting to turn their attention to how you then make some of those riparian strips into ecological corridors to allow the movement of plants and animals across the wider landscape. So we'll leave that, and if we have time for questions, otherwise you're going to be able to ask me questions in the panel discussion later. Thank you very much for your attention.